What does psychological maturity look like when no one is watching you? Not when you're calm in public, and not when you're explaining yourself well, not when you're saying all the right things about growth, boundaries, or healing, but when there is no audience, no validation, no reassurance coming from outside. This question matters because psychological maturity is often misunderstood. It's confused with emotional control, or with insight, or with good communication, but these are skills, not maturity. You can be articulate and still avoid responsibility. You can be emotionally intelligent and still betray yourself quietly. You can understand your patterns and still live in contradiction. Psychological maturity is not about how regulated you appear. It's about how you relate to truth, to responsibility, and discomfort when there is nothing to gain socially from doing so. Maturity begins where performance ends. When no one is watching, maturity shows up not as confidence or calm, but as a stance, a way of standing in your life that does not depend on applause, on approval, or constant reassurance. One of the clearest signs of psychological maturity is the ability to choose internal coherence over external validation. Immature functioning is organized around being seen, being understood, and affirmed, whereas mature functioning is organized around alignment. This does not mean mature people don't care about relationships or impact. Of course they do. It means they are no longer governed by the need to be continuously validated in order to trust their own choices. In earlier stages of psychological development, explanation feels necessary. You want others to understand why you decided what you decided. You want reassurance that you're not wrong or selfish or being unreasonable. But over time, something changes. You begin to realize that explaining does not always bring understanding, and that being understood is not the same as being aligned. Psychological maturity is choosing coherence over being understood. Mature people begin to tolerate being misread, not out of arrogance and not out of emotional shutdown, but because they are no longer willing to organize their lives around other people's interpretations. They stop correcting every misunderstanding. They stop justifying every boundary. Mature people stop narrating their inner world to make others comfortable with their choices. This is not withdrawal, it is consolidation, and it often feels lonely before it feels grounded. Now, let's imagine two people working in the same environment. They have similar roles at work, similar responsibilities, similar pressures. They are both competent, both people rely on, and they are both asked, again, to take on more than what is reasonable. From the outside, the situation is identical. Now, what differs is how each person responds internally. The first person, when asked to do more, agrees immediately, not because they want to, but because they feel uneasy saying no. They tell themselves they're being professional, that this is what maturity looks like, that being dependable really matters. But underneath, they actually feel resentful and unseen, and they are quietly depleted. Later, when the exhaustion show up, they begin to doubt themselves. Why am I always the one carrying this? They think to themselves, why does this keep happening to me? Their sense of self remains organized around approval, around being needed, and around being perceived as good. This is not immaturity in the childish sense. It is immaturity in the psychological sense. A self that still depends on external validation to feel legitimate. Now, let's look at the other person. They pause when they're asked to do more. They feel the same discomfort, they feel the same hesitation and the same awareness that saying no may cost them something. But instead of moving automatically, they take responsibility for their choice. They respond clearly, calmly, without over-explaining. They accept that this is something that may change how they are perceived. And they will also accept that they may no longer be the most praised or relied upon at work. And they do not rush to repair that loss, not because they don't care, but because their sense of self is no longer organized around constant reassurance from the outside. They feel the discomfort, but they tolerate the ambiguity and they stay aligned. Psychological maturity is not choosing comfort, it is choosing coherence and living with the cost. The difference between these two people is not confidence, it is not communication skills, and it is not emotional intelligence. It is where their sense of legitimacy comes from. One needs it reflected back, the other carries it internally. Maturity is staying aligned even when alignment stops being rewarded. This is what it looks like to live without constant external confirmation. You don't become cold or indifferent, you become steadier. Let's look at another defining feature of psychological maturity. It is the ability to hold contradiction without collapsing into certainty or self-erasure. What does that mean? Immature functioning seeks resolution at all costs. It wants things to feel clear, clean, and emotionally resolved all the time. Whereas mature functioning accepts that many adult realities are inherently contradictory. You can love someone and still limit them. You can feel guilt and still not undo a boundary. You can care deeply and still choose distance. Immaturity demands certainty. Maturity tolerates contradiction. This is not emotional confusion. It is emotional capacity. Maturity does not rush to eliminate discomfort by choosing, for example, extremes. It does not insist that something must be entirely right or entirely wrong in order to be lived with. Instead, it allows complexity to exist without immediately resolving it. This is especially important in long-standing relationships, not romantic ones, but familial ones. Let's imagine your relationship with a parent as an adult. You care about them, you respect parts of them, and you are also painfully aware of their limitations. Maybe because they are very intrusive or emotionally immature, or because they are critical or unable to meet you in the way you once needed. Psychological maturity will not require you to villainize them, and it does not require you to submit to them either. Instead, it asks something different. It asks you to hold love without compliance. You can answer the call, but you don't have to overshare, for example. You can show up, but you don't have to over-explain yourself. You allow disappointment to exist without trying to fix it every time. This is not coldness, this is differentiation. Maturity is loving your parents without organizing your life around their approval. You stop trying to be understood by someone who just cannot understand you, and you stop punishing yourself for wanting distance. This kind of maturity often looks quiet and unspectacular from the outside, but internally it requires enormous strength. One of the most subtle signs of psychological maturity is how a person relates to responsibility. Immature responsibility often comes with self-punishment, such as every mistake that a person makes, they look at it as a moral failure. Every limit becomes evidence of their selfishness. Whereas mature responsibility looks different. It says, "This is mine to hold without cruelty toward myself." You take responsibility for impact without collapsing into shame. You are capable of repairing without humiliating yourself internally. So you learn without turning into self-erasure. And shame is not accountability. Maturity corrects without crushing, and in that sense, it allows growth without internal violence. This is where a lot of people get stuck. They confuse being hard on themselves with being responsible. But again, psychological maturity knows the difference. Psychological maturity is not something you arrive at. It is something you practice repeatedly, quietly, without an audience. It looks like fewer explanations, slower reactions, less urgency to be right, and more willingness to stand alone when necessary. Maturity is not calm, and it is not insight, and it is not being liked. It is ethical consistency over time. When no one is watching, psychological maturity is simply this. You live in a way that does not require constant self-betrayal, and that, more than anything else, is what adulthood actually looks like.